morning. Sorry for the delay. We were waiting to see if we could get the internet gods to assist us, and they did quickly. Thank you to the IT folks as well. Good morning. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board. And I don't know why I read that. I always wanted to read that. Today's Wednesday, September 20th at 9:37 a.m., and the meeting's called to order. With me are, to my left, Vice Chair Stephen Moore, to my right, Board Member Dee Dee D'Adamo. Ms. Sobek, will you introduce the staff that's assisting today?
Yes, thank you, Chair Marcus. To my right are the Chief Deputies, Jonathan Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer, and to my left is Chief Counsel Michael Loffer, and assisting is Clerk to the Board Janine Townsend and Courtney Tyler.
Terrific, thanks. I think everybody here does know our emergency procedures, but just in case, look for the exit nearest you, and if you hear an emergency sound, proceed down the stairs out to Cesar Chavez Park, where we'll be gathering to wait for the all clear, and if you need assistance, somebody will definitely assist you to a protected area. If you have cell phones or other noise-making devices, please silence them. Just out of courtesy to everybody else. And again, thankfully, since the webcast is back up, when you come up to the microphone, just make sure you're close enough to be heard. And with that, we'll move on to the public hearing on the proposed draft amendment to the policy on supplemental environmental projects. We had a workshop on this earlier this year. This is the public hearing to take public comment. Written comments will be due next week on on Monday, and that's an extension of time from today, and the board will take action on this item in November 3rd? 7th? November 7th. And thank you. I know folks have engaged a lot since our past workshop, and with that, I will turn it over to our amazing team to lay out where we are.
Good morning. So I'm Dr. Matthew Bufflaman. I'll be sharing this presentation with Jasmine Oaxaca and David Boyers as counsel. So to get started here, like you've just mentioned, the purpose of this hearing is to mark the close of the public comment period, and it was extended to Monday, September 25th. This presentation is very similar to last month's workshop. We've added a couple more slides, but essentially we'll be running through the same outline and topics that we did previously.
No, that's helpful for anybody who wasn't at the workshop.
Yes. And so I'll start off with the background and the current SEP policy and how we're using SEPs. And then we'll talk a little bit about the need for the SEP policy amendment, and particularly Assembly Bill 1071. We'll talk about the policy issues and the directions, and then finally we'll go over the next steps and the timeline for that. So I'll start off. I've already used the acronym once or twice already. A SEP, what is a supplemental environmental project? It's defined in statute now. Actually, it's defined in several places in statute, but we'll use the AB 1071 language. It's an environmentally beneficial project that a person subject to an enforcement action voluntarily agrees to undertake in settlement of an action to offset a portion of the civil penalty. So what that means to us is when we're engaged in formal enforcement actions and seeking a penalty against a discharger, we always pretty much enter into settlement negotiations with the violators. And during that negotiation process, they can do a supplemental environmental project, a mutually agreed upon project to help resolve and settle that enforcement action. And we do try to reach settlements in pretty much all our enforcement cases, and we're really quite successful in this regard. So there is a potential to use SEPs quite a bit. So our current SEP policy, it was adopted in 2009. It was previously included in the enforcement policy. At the time, though, it was separated out to help guide the evaluation of supplemental environmental projects, to ensure that the selected projects had environmental value, to further the enforcement goals of the water boards and to ensure that the SEPs are subject to the appropriate input and oversight by the water boards. So there's been a number of changes since 2009, including, of course, Assembly Bill 1071, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But there's also been the human right to water. There's been the enforcement policy that was approved earlier this year. We want to make the policy explicitly include the division of water rights and a division of drinking water. And then also we've reorganized the policy to help provide greater clarity, transparency, and hopefully the ease of implementing the policy. So this is data from one of our databases. It's the SEP utilization rate since 2000. As a note, ECAs is an acronym on this table. That stands for Enhanced Compliance Actions. Those are defined in our enforcement policy. For practical purposes, ECAs are really a subset of SEPs, and so that's why they're included on this table. But as you can see from this table, from 2000 to about 2007, they were utilized in about 15 to 30% of the ACLs. Then with the development of the 2009 policy, there was a drop-off in the utilization of SEPs, and then more recently, they're starting to be used a little bit more in 2015 and 2016. The total value of SEPs ranges between $1 million and $7.6 million per year. And a little more detailed breakdown that's not included on this table, but say that regions 2, the San Francisco Bay region, region 4, the LA region, and region 5, the Central Valley region, are regions that usually have the most SEPs. And that's part of the fact that they're larger regions containing more facilities, and there's usually more enforcement actions in those regions. I'll move on to describing Assembly Bill 1071, which chaptered in 2015. So each BDO, that's Board, Department, or Office within Cal EPA, is required to establish a policy on the SEPs that benefits disadvantaged communities. The policy shall include, but not need be limited to, all the following points. 1, a public process to solicit potential supplemental environmental projects from disadvantaged communities. 2, allowing the amount of the supplemental environmental project to be up to 50% of the enforcement action brought under the jurisdiction of the board. 3, an annual list of supplemental projects that may be selected to settle a portion of an enforcement action under the jurisdiction of the board. And 4, a consideration between the relationship between the location of the violation and the location of the proposed SEP. So we're a little bit behind the ball game. The other BDOs have established their policies last year, by the end of last year, and so part of the reason we're bringing amendments to the SEP policy now is to kind of catch up and making sure we're in compliance with Assembly Bill 1071. And so with that, I will pass the more detailed information to Ms. Oaxaca.
Sorry about the slides again. So these next few slides go over the key policy issues that were considered and the direction taken in the draft. Per Public Resources Code, which I will refer to as for AB 1071, a public process is to be established to solicit potential SEPs from disadvantaged communities or DACs. The current policy does not address project solicitation. This is being done currently to varying degrees among our regional water boards. The San Diego region recently went through this process, and their outreach included noticing the solicitation form on their website, hosting a workshop about how to propose a project, and they conducted targeted outreach with EJDAC groups in the community. The proposals were prioritized and the list was approved by their board in February of this year. They plan to update their list as needed, but it is a time-intensive process. Other regions have not been able to keep an active list alive, mostly due to staffing issues, but also the limited number of ACLs in their regions, or the trend that when dischargers do choose to do a SEP, they may tend to do enhanced compliance actions, which more directly benefit the discharger over SEPs in the DACs.
On that point, sorry to interrupt. Sometimes ECAs, though, would benefit dischargers that are within disadvantaged communities. Is that right? I mean, so there is a link sometimes.
In the proposed policy, the State Water Board's Office of Enforcement shall post a SEP proposal form, guidance, and evaluation criteria on its website to solicit SEPs from the general public, including DACs. And it leaves flexibility for regional water boards and state water board divisions to create and post their own versions of these documents consistent with the policy. It also encourages water boards to conduct additional outreach in DACs at an appropriate frequency for their region to gain community input and actively seek SEP proposals. I wanted to note here that Cali, PA has recently developed a general BDO-wide SEP proposal form for all the agencies within Cali, PA, and it was just posted on their website last Friday. This will be a good way to solicit any multimedia SEP proposals, but they will also be routing the water-related proposals to our Office of Enforcement. Information requested in the form includes organization name and contact information, proposed project information such as project name, location, environmental issue to be addressed, a brief description of the project, potential benefits, and estimated cost. For the amount of SEP, per the Public Resources Code, the amount of a SEP shall be up to 50% of the total administrative civil liability. In the current policy, the maximum is 50%, but the OE director can approve SEPs greater than this with compelling justification. And this has happened for only a handful of SEPs so far. Now, the caveat here is that more money to SEPs means less money to the cleanup and abatement account or waste discharge permit fund. And the cleanup and abatement account has a lot of money, millions of dollars have been going towards drinking water and drought emergency projects in DACs in the past couple years. However, more money to SEPs would mean greater potential for restorative justice in the community through the nexus requirement, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. The proposed policy maintains the current language of the 50% cap. The OE director can still approve greater than this with compelling justification. And there is an addition that SEPs may be approved in amounts greater than 50% if the SEP will be located in or benefit a disadvantaged community, an environmental justice community or EJ community, a community with a financial hardship, or if it furthers the human right to water. For the annual SEP list, per Public Resources Code, there shall be an annual list of SEPs that may be selected to settle a portion of an enforcement action. The current policy states that the regional boards may maintain and post a list of these potential SEPs, though frequency and criteria are not specified. The State Water Board has compiled and posted a statewide potential SEP list on its website. So the proposed policy requires regional boards and the State Water Board's divisions to maintain and post the list of potential SEPs, and the Office of Enforcement will continue to compile and post a statewide list on an annual basis. It allows flexibility for each water board or division to determine the level of prioritization and pre-approval that is appropriate for their available staff resources. For example, they may choose to evaluate all the SEP proposals, prioritize them, and have their board pre-approve them before they're placed on the list. Or they may screen the SEP proposals and place them on the list with the understanding that the details would be hashed out during settlement negotiations. Or they may simply place any SEP proposal on the list and flesh out the details in the time of settlement. A quick side note about potential SEP list. Cali PA also has a BDO-wide list of potential SEPs on its website. It has about 130 potential projects over the 5 BDOs currently. And going back to public process, their website refers the public to each appropriate BDO for SEP proposals, and they just posted their general BDO-wide SEP proposal form to their website. On the Water Board SEP webpage, in the last half of the page is a link to the statewide Water Board's potential SEP list, which currently has about 90 projects. And it now also links to Cali PA's general SEP proposal form. After the proposed policy is adopted, additional guidance on how to create or how to propose a SEP will be included in this section of the website. So for Nexus, per Public Resources Code, there shall be a relationship between the location of the violation and the location of the proposed SEP. The current policy requires a relationship between the nature or location of the violation and the nature or location of the proposed SEP. The proposed policy maintains current language and includes some examples of when an adequate nexus relationship exists. A location nexus may mean the same community watershed or be within a 50-mile radius, for example. A nature nexus may be if the SEP is designed to reduce the likelihood of similar violations in the future or reduce adverse impacts to public health and/or environment to which the violation contributes or could potentially affect. For third-party administered SEPs, we talked about adding more clarity around these requirements, mostly because regional board approaches have evolved over the last couple years, and clarification was needed on the use of third parties, especially who bears the risk of loss should a SEP fail. The proposed policy maintains that the discharger retains liability for SEPs performed by a third party for the discharger until the SEP is successfully completed. It recommends that water boards that prefer to use a third party to administer all the SEPs within their geographic or subject matter jurisdiction to ensure that the third party is financially stable and capable of implementing and completing SEPs. It also requires that SEP funds be spent on a specific project defined in the stipulated order within 24 months, though it does allow extension for good cause. With regards to settlement accounts, we talked about adding requirements around establishing accounts for the placement of funds before SEPs are implemented, as well as adding requirements for money intended for SEPs that are deposited into third-party managed funds. The current policy prohibits depositing funds in an account managed by a regional board unless it is authorized by statute. Some regional boards are directing SEP money into accounts managed by third parties for regional scale programs. The proposed policy requires SEPs to be specific projects with an adequate nexus to the violation that are defined in the stipulated order. Depositing money intended for SEPs into a third-party managed fund would need to be allotted to a specific project and approved and agreed upon at the time of the stipulated order and be spent within 24 months. For oversight costs, we talked about modifying the oversight provisions to further incentivize SEPs. The current policy requires oversight costs be paid in addition to the amount of the SEP. And past experience has shown that this can discourage dischargers from choosing SEPs, especially third-party administered SEPs or those on the potential SEP list. So the proposed policy allows oversight costs of up to 10% to be included as part of the total SEP if the SEP will be located in or benefit a DAC, EJ community, a community with a financial hardship, or if it furthers the human right to water. For audits, we talked about specifying cases in which a third-party financial audit is required to certify SEP completion. Past experience has shown that not all SEPs are satisfactorily completed, but water boards do not have adequate staffing or expertise to fully verify each SEP as completed per the stipulated order. The proposed policy requires a third-party financial audit for any SEP with a direct cost of over $1 million. It also allows any audit to be part of the SEP amount, though at the sole cost of the responsible party. With regards to small settlements, the issue here is adding requirements related to the aggregation of several small settlements to fund a larger SEP. The current policy does not contain specific requirements, but we are soliciting feedback on it during this comment period. The proposed policy does not yet address this issue. We could consider placing a cap on the settlement amount eligible to fund a SEP rather than allowing funds to aggregate before going towards a SEP. The aggregation of small settlements to fund a larger SEP may be risky in terms of maintaining nexus and liability sharing between different responsible parties if the SEP fails. Some of the preliminary comments we have received include the projects not acceptable as SEP section, to clarify certain items on the list, to not be overly restrictive, and to harmonize their intent with the rest of the policy. For the amount of SEP, to consider allowing SEPs that would directly benefit a DAC or EJ community to exceed the 50% cap without approval from the OE director. On third-party administered SEPs and liability, to consider transfer of liability from discharger to third-party administrator to further incentivize SEPs. And on the aggregation of small settlements, to consider allowing for aggregation to fund larger SEPs with greater impacts to the community. This may require increasing time for accrual and implementation to greater than 24 months. So the next steps in our process, the public comment period will end on Monday, September 25th, and we are hopeful to address all the comments and move towards adoption at the November 7th meeting.
Great. Great. Do we have any questions before we go to public comment? See what folks have to say. I think I have 3 comments. Yeah, that's right. We'll have Nicole Granquist from the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, followed by Debbie Orris from the Community Water Center, followed by Michael Warburton.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. My name is Nicole Granquist, and Adam Link from CASA is unable to attend today, so I'll do my best impression. So thank you for allowing me to appear on their behalf. Overall, the proposed policy, we think, follows many of the processes currently in which we negotiate SEPs, and so we're generally supportive of the policy. And we appreciate staff's willingness to talk to us about some of the concerns that we have had on the proposed policy. We've been engaged with them over the last few weeks. We really appreciate Chris, Dave, and Matthew's efforts to engage with us on those points. And there have been items we've discussed about some changes that they may make, so we won't belabor some of those points. Our primary concern, and I think you may have heard from Adam last go round, is really the list of items that are not acceptable as SEPs. And in general, sort of from a broad standpoint, the primary issue is some of the broad language that is used. There's a variety of SEPs that have been negotiated in settlements over the past, let's just use 5 years, that might be subject to exclusion with the list as currently written. And that's really, we've been engaging with the Office of Enforcement staff to recognize what all of us understand is sort of the point of some of the descriptions, but the way they're written, they could be too broadly construed and they might preclude a very valuable and good SEP. So just to give you a few examples.
Oh, yeah, great.
Yeah, so if you sort of look at the list of the sort of excluded, which is on pages, starts at the bottom of page 6, top of page 7 of the red line. When there's discussions about donations to community groups, environmental organizations, state, local, federal entities, or other third parties, we certainly understand that the purpose of that is to eliminate money just going to an organization with no project. But the issue is, of course, sometimes projects are implemented by those groups, and the person who is subject to the ACL, who is paying the SEP, will be sending a cash amount to those groups. So we really need some language that is clarifying that cash donations without an identifiable project and all of the descriptions that the SEP policy would otherwise require would be acceptable. What's precluded is the idea of, I'm just going to send this money to this group.
Got it.
And that's fine with us because we don't have a problem with that idea. But what we didn't want to have is, gee, we've got this great SEP and it's being run by X university or X environmental group. And because we are physically sending them a cash donation to do that project, that it would be precluded. So some of these things are semantics. I don't think we have a lot of underlying disagreement on some of these matters. Another item is the monitoring program section. I think that that's one of the items that is most concerning. It's number 7 on the list, where it says studies, assessments, or monitoring programs without a requirement to address the problems identified in the study. It's that language that gives us a lot of pause. There are a variety of water quality issues that require further study before solutions can be brought. And understanding a problem can be, one of the biggest issues in terms of having enough technical data that everybody can get in a room and say, okay, what's the real issue here and what's the solution? And recently there have been a number of settlements I've been involved in where the SEP money went to monitoring a very specific problem. So it wasn't just general money sended to, a regional monitoring program. It was for a specific project. And I think the problem here is that in the case that I worked on for a specific discharger, they have nothing to do with the issue that was being studied. So this idea that the regional water board staff said, hey, would you be interested in doing this as a SEP because we really need to investigate this? And we said, yeah, that seems like that makes good sense. We're going to be spending this, sending this money somewhere. We might as well do something good with it. And in that circumstance, the only way under the current policy that they would have is if they would have accepted the responsibility for solving that problem.
Oh, I see.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
Because they have nothing to do with the problem, which is in part why they're willing to do that SEP, because it's not something really that's ever going to come back to bite them, for lack of a better word.
So sorry to interrupt. On this issue, is there a middle ground where you could replace the word requirement with recommendations, so that the monitoring still has a focus to it that would lead to a set of recommendations, but not necessarily obligations to implement by the SEP funder?
I think that, quite frankly, it's usually the SEP funder who would not be making those recommendations. So if we could write it in a way where it was monitoring that might lead to a regulatory agency making recommendations about solutions, I don't know that the discharger community would have any problem with that, because usually the person who's funding the SEP really isn't necessarily going to be the one who is dictating sometimes the solutions. Certainly there's middle ground. I'm sure we can find something that sort of gets at the issue, but I think what you're going to see is a significant chilling effect of folks' willingness to do those projects.
If they're then buying more responsibility than
That's
they
right,
would have otherwise.
especially
Sure.
if it's completely disassociated from perhaps, the reason that they're in that enforcement discussion in the first place. So that's I would say that is sort of one of the top of our concerns. Given that there's been a lot of monitoring work that's been done under SEPs, it's been very valuable.
Right.
The last sort of item that we wanted to bring to your attention would be that there's number 12. It prohibits projects for which completion depends on the actions or contributions of individuals or entities that are neither party to the settlement nor hired by the responsible party as an implementer. And my sense is that the basis for this was precluding SEPs that could never happen if, some other entity never gets their act together. And we certainly understand that when folks agree to do SEPs, you want to see them actually happen. However, almost every SEP requires the actions of some third party. And so I think the broadness of this language takes almost every SEP you can come up with and would exclude it, because there's almost always going to be a third party that's required to do something to implement the SEP. So again, it's a matter of sort of tweaking the language to make it more clear as to what we're talking about. Quite frankly, our recommendation under number 12 would be to strike it entirely, because we sat around trying to come up with ways to massage this. But given that almost every instance requires a third party, it was sort of tough for us to come up with something that tried to meet you in the middle. So I think all projects require, some form of action, whether it's permitting by another agency, whether it's getting approval from a county entity to go do something at a creek, whatever it may be. Most of the time we're dealing with another party. So we saw that as sort of an unnecessary restriction, and it might just sort of kill a lot of good SEPs that you'd want to see happen.
Well, and maybe I'm misunderstanding or thinking of it, I didn't go back to 12 in here, of a different thing. Isn't the issue just making sure that the sort of the choosing of the SEP and how it is something that the entity who's paying for it has some skin in the game to make sure it actually happens?
I personally, and I'll read you the language, I don't think that's meant, but I'm happy to have you chime in if I'm wrong. It says projects for which completion depends on the actions or contributions of individuals or entities that are neither party to the settlement nor hired by the responsible party as an implementer.
Oh, I see.
In most cases, that's going to be, another agency you might need an approval from, or some other, maybe you've partnered with another agency to do a project. This one I struggle with, just because I can come up with a whole lot of SEPs that were great projects that this would fall into. So I think if there's something more specific, if there's a particular circumstance that happened that would be viewed as negative, maybe tailor the language to more fine tune to that particular circumstance. We looked at a lot of SEPs that our agencies have performed over the last 5 or 10 years, and a lot of them would fall into this category. And so we sort of feel like it's unnecessarily restrictive.
Well, it's interesting too, going back to something you said earlier and thinking about SEPs I've known and loved, that there, when you're doing a SEP where the purpose of it is illuminating, like one of those studies or whatever,
Yes.
then you don't own I've done them where you're advancing the state of knowledge, but then you're not buying into doing the multi-million-dollar, you're laying the information out that people can use to get another entity, for example, to do things.
That's exactly right. And that was the SEP that we just agreed to on behalf of a client of mine. It's exactly that circumstance. And that, of course, also might depend on, even that monitoring program might depend on a third party who's maybe doing the monitoring, who is neither, if you look at this language, the party to the settlement nor hired by the responsible party. In our case, it was folks involved with the state who was going to do that monitoring. Well, then that would be excluded under number 12.
Okay.
So we struggle with that just from a practical standpoint. And so if there's a particular issue that, or a particular project that may have given folks pause in the past that was directed at, perhaps we can fine tune it. Our recommendation, of course, is to remove that, because we think it's going to be very difficult to narrow it such that it works for whatever the problem was, but we're not we don't know exactly what it was identified for. And then just a few items, since I know my time is up. We have spoken with staff about some of the language in the SEP policy about changes, where the language currently says we can change it for any reason anytime in the future. We said, gee, we'd appreciate you following the same public process. Staff has said they agree, and we'll be making revisions, so we really appreciate that. I think the only other item associated with that is when the regional water boards might make the same, the policy allows regional water boards to come up with some of their own criteria and some of their own implementation, which we understand from a regional perspective, but we just simply ask that they also, if there's major shift changes or big policy decisions, not sort of minor implementation issues, that they go through that same public process. Because it is very helpful then for folks to understand what the playing field is with SEPs and that everyone's sort of speaking the same language. And then the last item is the 24-month period. We certainly understand that the state is looking for SEPs that can be implemented immediately and that can be accomplished, and that the funds that were meant to, for purposes of penalties, get expended and spent. Certainly no argument from us, but we certainly have seen over time a number of SEPs that wouldn't qualify under the 24-month criteria. We understand that there is exception for good cause language, but I think here's the problem. The way that the policy is written now, it's 24 months, and then sort of it makes it sound like extensions later for good cause. That means that you won't even be able to talk about a project that lasts for more than 24 months from the inception.
So you want good cause to apply at the inception of
That
it.
would be great. And a lot of projects are going to be fine in the 24 months, but I can see where some folks might want a project that it might be a 3-year project.
Right.
And we just don't want the preclusion of the
Right.
discussion. And then the other item would be if there's other approvals that are necessary. So let's just say, we'll just use let's say a creek cleanup. Well, you have to go talk to Fish and Wildlife and the Corps and all of that. And we all know that those things take longer than we like them to. And so the other clarification might be to also say, if approvals are needed for implementation of the project, that it would be 24 months from the project being permitted, and maybe have some time frame for sort of what appropriate permitting timeframes might be, a 2-year period, something like that, sort of looking at the landscape of dealing with agencies and getting permits, so that if there is a bigger project that does require other state or federal agency approvals, that wouldn't be precluded. So those are just sort of the types of things that we want to introduce from a practical perspective that sort of allow us to keep moving on with this process, because we do think there are a lot of valuable projects out there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, so that point about you're fine, about when the clock starts in SEPs that require multi-agency approvals prior to implementation, those, I think, does that sound like something we could?
Yeah, definitely. We were thinking about defining what an example of a good cause would be, and like permitting issues would definitely be a good cause for an extension, and defining that term a little bit better.
Yeah, and perhaps, like was suggested, having it at the inception and not requiring extensions after the fact.
Yes.
In certain cases, you'll come up with something. Great.
So Nicole had wondered about 12, and I actually have an example of, which I think this was meant to address.
Oh, yeah, what was it meant to address?
Except that I was involved in as an executive officer, required contributions by others before it could happen. It has now been 12 years. It still hasn't happened.
I know the project you're speaking of. I'm familiar.
Yeah, and it sounded like a great idea at the time. It was
Yeah.
thought it was going to move forward quickly. They put, I don't know, $2 million into the project, and it's still sitting there.
It's still sitting there.
And I think this is from my point of view, the idea of taking out actions and just leaving contributions in would satisfy that problem, because the problem with the project, it was a like $10 million project. This was the seed money to get the rest of it, but no other money has come in.
Yeah, there were a lot of promises made that didn't come through. Yeah.
And so I think that's the idea that having a project that requires contributions from others that aren't committed yet
Yeah.
is the problem from my point of view. I don't know if that's what the staff was thinking about. But.
Yeah, that's exactly the intent, is to make sure that when a SEP is proposed, that we can get to a finished project. And so if there's a project that requires other entities to engage to complete the project, then that would not be acceptable as a SEP. under the
Could I
proposed
make a
policy.
fine tune of
Yeah, you could
other
fine-tune that.
contributions might be okay if they are
If they come
already
in.
committed? Because I know that when Debbie Webster was here on Civiqua and you guys were talking about trying to aggregate some of the smaller SEPs to do something with, Central Valley issues, et cetera, that would be another agency contribution. But if it's already committed, then I think we would avoid the issue that has come up for them. Because in that circumstance, the money wasn't on paper committed. So on paper committed contributions, I think we could all live with that, because then that might avoid some of the pitfalls.
Yeah, and it speaks to where SEPs really are useful, which is sometimes, filling those gaps
Yeah.
on something that's already got momentum.
Right.
And not the case that Mr. Bishop brought up where you seed something and try to get it off the ground, that it's
Right.
major. And
Right.
so,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, you could also have a
A drop dead date.
drop dead date, right?
And I think we could live with that.
Ways to deal with it.
Yeah, if there was a contribution that if it doesn't happen within some period of time, then you either come up with another step or you send
Yeah,
it to the cleanup and
right,
abatement
right.
account. Yeah.
All right, helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Ms. Orris?
Good morning,
Good
everyone.
morning.
My name is Debbie Orrs with the Community Water Center. So first, would just like to thank staff for the amendments that have been proposed with this SEP policy, especially the inclusion of the human right to water as a focus throughout the policy. One of the most important changes that we appreciate is the increasing the cap for SEPs
Yeah.
for within DACs, and because some of these communities are in
Yeah.
dire need of help. But one change that we would like to see within that is the policy says located within a DAC. However, you could have a project that's located in a DAC that doesn't actually benefit them. One example is you could have a dairy digester, which helps air and water quality as a whole, but can lead to higher freight and worsen air quality within that DAC. So we would suggest the change would be directly benefits a DAC. You could also have a project that's right outside a DAC that directly benefits them, especially if the DAC is, say, getting their water supply from outside their boundaries.
Sure.
That would be directly benefiting the DAC. And really that's consistent with the goal of this in 1071. We also appreciate the inclusion of having that online form to solicit SEPs. However, we would also like to see a mandatory outreach to DACs. Internet is notoriously bad within a lot of disadvantaged communities, so just having a form online won't help a lot of communities be able to solicit a project within their community. So if there's real outreach, direct outreach to these communities, we could probably get some more SEPs that are really helping those who are in the most need. And then on the issue of small settlements, definitely understand a lot of the concerns that staff and others have raised with issues of nexus and being able to use it in time, but would like to see a way to be able to aggregate small settlements if you have a project where maybe someone was going to do an education project. If we could get multiple people who are maybe contributing to water quality issues, you could do education and do treatment, something that individually people might not be able to do, but together can actually do some sort of, rather than just going, hey, your water's contaminated, and this is what we're doing to fix it. So that, I think we can see a lot of really big benefit there.
So this is another case where it's similar to some of the things Ms. Granquist that it mentioned, that in terms of trying to avoid what could be a negative, our language is overbroad and could exclude something positive. So trying to come up with more tailored language would be helpful.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the kind of the drop dead date. I mean, if you go, I'll put this money in to try and seed a project, and if at a certain time it doesn't, then you have to go on to a different SEP. I think that would be a good way to really kind of, because then you have the money on paper that's incentive to the paper commitment, and then more people can join in. And then Nexus, I just would like to, there's some of the language that says, especially location, it could be community watershed or within 50 miles. For communities, if they're dealing with bad drinking water, 50 miles away might not actually be helping them. So just being careful about that. If someone is impacted by the violation, that the SEP is helping them. And then finally, just further, we would like to see more incentives for choosing SEPs within DACs. I believe the oversight cost, being able to fold that in for DACs, I'm assuming is an incentive for choosing them. However, if the violator has the money, I would rather see that money actually be going towards fixing the problem rather than really covering, being able to use that money for the oversight costs that normally would be paid for separately. Which, and I get it if you think that's the best way to kind of incentivize people and make the most out of limited funds, but it should be based on each individual case by case basis.
Probably have the ability to deal with that. I mean, the issue is you can't make someone do a SEP.
Yes, exactly. But just one of the many factors that are considered.
Yeah.
And, fortunately, too, that these decisions are publicly vetted. So there's, we're trying to create a framework that has some flexibility that regional boards will use and publicly vet at the appropriate time. And those issues, the 50-mile issue you brought up, can go through that subsequent process under this framework.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Warburton from the Public Trust Alliance.
Wow. I want to really thank the state board for pursuing this because in our work, leadership looks different under climate change. And some things that don't look environmental, you need something that says, hey, you can understand this as environmental. And not only leadership, but the word reasonable. I think this is one of the most effective attempts to grapple with the problem of reasonable use and actually public discussion of it, public vetting of it. And the problem is that many people involved in lawsuits, well, there's some in the water community who almost feel like the law obligates them to be unreasonable. And they want to do something unreasonable. And I was amazed at, both the dischargers and, hey, these environmental projects are a very constructive way for staying out of litigation. And the problem is that the language, some of the tweaks, are make work projects for lawyers. And this board has been incredibly good at make working projects for lawyers. And I think the discretion is incredibly important, and also the reliance on public process to vet some of the decisions as they're being made, because some of the people who are using legal process to do unreasonable things don't want the process to take place in public, because the experts can take care of this. And the problem is the experts have been behind closed doors for a lot of the problems that the state board has been working on. And I'm just very, very grateful that this takes a possible solution and puts it up, to the community who can suggest some projects that would never occur to some of the business interests involved because that's not the business they're in. And business sometimes is better, they like to do it behind closed doors rather than in the open. And I think this is extremely valuable for both getting discussions into the open, and in some areas, I think there are discussions that have been occurring behind closed doors for decades that the communities haven't felt that they could even participate in. And this idea of soliciting projects in settlement for, really recognizable wrongdoing, but also to locate it with that first increment of water, the water that is recognized in the human right to water is domestic use of water. And I think some agreements with the state water board have put everything on the same playing field when it's not. Drinking water is on another playing field, and it is a higher priority. And basic sanitation, no matter whether it's for a rich community or a poor community. These are things that, anyway, thank you very, very much for
thank you.
going in this direction.
Thanks very much. Any comments before we close? Thank you all. Thanks for the thoughtful comments and the thoughtful work to come as the comments come in next week. And I'm sure people will give us a lot of suggestions on how to play with the language. Anything? Anything? All right. Well, with that, thank you very much. Appreciate the time. Appreciate all the hard work, not just in this hearing, but all the conversations you've been having before and since the workshop, and a lot to think about. Very helpful. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Loffer, am I allowed to adjourn this meeting? Then I shall. That's right, meeting adjourned. Okay.